Hey everyone, welcome back to a new video, and in this video I'm going to show you how you can introduce caching layer in your Paging 3 API. So in our previous video we saw how to use paging source to grab all of the information from the backend in a form of pages and show those information to our composable UI. Now I want to introduce caching layer so that if the same query is already searched by the user, so instead of going to the remote data source to grab the same information, we should look into our room database first, and if the information is present regarding that query, then we will fetch the information from the room database. And if we are running out of the information corresponding to this query, then we will start fetching the extra information from the remote data source. So basically in this case our room database will become the single source of truth. All the information that you are getting from the backend will be stored in our room database first, and this room database will expose this information in a form of pages, and these pages will be consumed by your ViewModel or user interface. You can show the information to your user. So basically this is the flow. So let's get started and see how we can use this thing in our project. By the way, if you haven't watched my first part, please watch that video, because if you are not watching that video, then this video it doesn't mean anything for you. So let's begin with our project. So for that, first go to your libs version toml file and add all of this dependency corresponding to the room database. Open up your module app level Gradle file. So first you have to add room database dependency, then we have its compiler, and lastly paging dependency. Cool. So let's begin with our journey by creating application database. So AppDatabase, this is an abstract class and this will extend a room database. On the top you should use here database. We have entities in it, so entities is the information that you want to store in this room database. Version is 1. So first thing first, in this abstract class app database, I'm going to create an companion object, and this contain a function naming get instance. Pass your context in it, and this will return you application database. So a room database builder, pass your context. Next you have to pass your database class type. So app database class.java. Lastly you have to mention the file name. So I'm going to call this app_database and build it. So we are pretty much done with our get instance function. Now it's time to create entities. So for that, open up your data layer model, and in this model I'm going to create a package, and the package name is local, that contains two different entities. So first we have image entity. This is a data class, and in this data class we have id. Then we have image URL, type of this thing is string, and lastly we have query, corresponding to which query this information is used. So on the top, make sure to use here entity annotation, and also every entity has a primary key, and I want to use auto generate false. So this is our first image entity, and next we are going to create a remote key. Now this remote key contains all of the information regarding the previous key and the next key for each images. So let's create a data class, and this data class I have id. Next we have previous key. Type of this thing is integer and it is nullable. Next we have next key, again type of this thing is integer and it is nullable. And lastly I'm going to store the query, corresponding to which query this information is stored. On the top, make sure to use entity annotation, and on top of your id use your primary key auto generate false. Go to your application database, and in the entity just mention your image entity class and your remote key class. Now it's time to create data access object. So for that, in this data layer I'm going to create a package, and the package name is local, that contain our both data access object. First we have image data access object. This is an interface. Make sure to use here annotation data access object, or you can say DAO. So first I want to insert, and my conflict strategy will be replace. So use here replace. Suspend function insert all, and I want to insert list of image entities. Next I'm going to write a query, and this query is actually used to get all of the information from the room database corresponding to a query. So select all from image entity where query is equivalent to the past query. Function get images, pass your query. and it will return you paging source image entity. Okay, so basically, as I told you, this room database will act as a single source of truth. Remote mediator is something which contain all of the logic to fetch information and store that information in your room database. Now a room database will actually use to expose all of the information that you have been stored with the help of remote mediator logic. Next, I'm going to create one more query. That this query is actually used to delete from image entity where query is equivalent to past query. Suspend function nuke table corresponding to query that I am passing in here. So we have three different function. Next, I'm going to write one more function which actually return the count of the row corresponding to a query. So for that, write a query, and in this I'm using select count all from image entity where our query is equivalent to the past query. Suspend function get count corresponding to query. Pass your query. Return type of this thing is integer. So this is our image data access object. Similarly, I'm going to create one more data access object for our remote key. Make sure to annotate this thing with data access object, and in this first I'm going to write a function which actually used to insert all of the information. On config strategy will be replace suspend function insert all list. Type of this thing is a list of remote key. Okay, so next I'm going to create one more function which is query. Select all from remote key where query is equivalent to the past query. So suspend function get remote and pass id, and instead of using query we should use id, because in remote mediator we will use image id to fetch remote key corresponding to that. So id is type of string and it will return a remote key. Sometime it may null, so that's why I'm using a remote key. Instead of query I'm using here id and pass the past id. So next I'm going to write one more query, and this query is actually used to delete all from our remote key where query is equivalent to the past query. Suspend function delete remote key corresponding to query and pass your query. That's it. We have three different functions for a remote key. Now it's time to write its implementation. So for that, go to your application database, and at the bottom use your abstract function get ImageDao, and it will return you image data access object. Next we have one more abstract function get remote key data access object, and it will return remote key data access object, and make sure this spelling is right, IMAGE. Cool. So we are pretty much done with our room database setup. Now it's time to provide all of the information with Dagger Hilt. So go to your DI data module, and at the bottom I'm going to write few provide functions. So provide singleton, let me make some space for you. Function provide application database, pass your application context in it, and it will return application database. So return AppDatabase get instance, pass your context in it. Just below to it I'm gonna write two more provide function which actually provide the data access object implementation. So provide ImageDao. For this we have to use the reference of our AppDatabase, and it will return image data access object implementation. So AppDatabase get ImageDao. Next we have singleton provide function, and the function name is provide remote key data access object. Use your application database instance, and it will return remote key data access object. Application database dot get remote key data access object. Now we have all the information related to the database in our dependency graph. Now I'm going to write few mapper function that we will use in this video in future. So for that, open up your mapper package, and in this mapper package I'm going to create two different classes. So first class is actually used to convert data transfer object into image entity. So data transfer object to image entity mapper. This class uses mapper interface and I want to convert ImageDTO to image entity. Override map, return image entity. Press Alt Enter to specify all the remaining argument by name, and in place of ID I'm gonna use from.id and convert this thing into a string. Next we have image URL. So from large image URL for the query, I'm gonna pass this query in a form of constructor parameter. So private wall query, type of this thing is a string, and simply use this query in here. And next I'm gonna write one more mapper function which is actually used to map image entity into image, or you can say image entity into domain layer image. So image entity to image mapper interface, image entity to image, return image, Alt Enter to specify all the remaining arguments. So in place of ID I'm gonna use from.id, in place of image URL I'm using from.image URL, and in place of UUID I'm using here UUID random UUID.toString. And also I want to attach this thing in our dependency graph. So for that simply use inject constructor, import this thing up. Alright, so we are pretty much done with our mapper things. So now we are going to write remote mediator. So this remote mediator contain all of the logic which is used to fetch and store information into your room database. So for that I'm gonna create a class, and the class name is image remote mediator. So this class extend remote mediator. We have key as an integer and value is image entity. Use constructor invocation and just use all of the function that our remote mediator have. We have load, and we have one more function naming Initialize that we'll use later in this video. Make sure to annotate your class with experimental paging API because this is an experimental API. Let's begin with our load function. So in this load, first I'm gonna calculate my page. So this page will eventually depend on our load type. We have three different types of load type. Just use all of that things. We have refresh, prepend and append. Now it's time to write logic to get the page corresponding to the refresh, prepend and append. So for the refresh I'm using my state.anchor position. By the way, this state contain all of the information regarding your paging source which is present in your room database. So we have state.anchor position, and in this anchor position we'll check if it is not null. On that case I'm using state.closest item to position, pass your anchor position. This will give you the image entity. Just check if it is not null. On that case I'm using my remote key data access object and grep the remote key corresponding to this image entity. Remote key contain information for the next page and the previous page. So for that, first thing first, let's use here private wall query. Next I'm gonna pass my image data access object. Next I'm gonna pass remote key data access object, and lastly I'm gonna pass my API service because in future we will use this API service to fetch information from the backend. So now in this I'm gonna use my remote key data access object dot get remote key it.id, and this will give us remote key. Now we in this remote key we have next page. Next key means next page. So we have next page. Simply subtract 1 to get the current page, and if it is null on that case simply return 1. So this is the logic for the refresh. Next I'm gonna write logic for the prepend. So use state.pages. So this will give you a list of pages. So let's say you are having 10 different pages into your room database, so it will give you the list of those 10 pages. Now in this, because we want to prepend something, I'm interested only the first page. So first or null, and as you already know, in pages we have list of image entity, and if you want to see the list of image entities you can use here it.data. So it dot data is not empty, then I'm gonna use my data and fetch the first item from the first page. So first or null. So if it is not null, on that case use a remote key data access object dot get remote key it dot id. This will give you the remote key. Remote key contain the information about the next and previous page. So remote key dot previous page, because we are in the prepend, and if it is null, simply use a return mediator result dot success. In this success we have parameter naming end of pagination reached. So we'll decide this thing with remote key. If it is not null, that means we are at the end of our pagination. Now for the append we have very similar logic. So vol remote key state dot pages last or null. So basically we are interested in the last page. It dot data is not empty, then I'm using this data and use the last item. So last or null. If it is not null, on that case use remote key data access object dot get remote key, pass the id corresponding to this image item. We have remote key. Use your remote key dot next, and if it is null, return the mediator result dot success, and end of pagination is decided with the help of remote key nullability. So this logic is actually used to get the page. Now we have our page. It's time to fetch information from the backend and store it in our room database. So I'm using here try catch because we want to communicate with our backend, and sometime it may throw an exception. Mediator result dot error. If we are receiving any exception, simply use mediator result dot error and pass this exception. So first I'm gonna fetch my response. So this response is coming from API service dot get images, pass your query in place of queue. Next we have to pass the page. This will give us the response. Now in this I'm going to create one more variable naming remote images and check if we are having any duplicate ID. We'll simply remove that thing. So response dot hits dot distinct by it dot id. Now it's time to see whether we are at the end of pagination or not. So for that I'm going to create one variable naming end of pagination reached. So remote images dot size. If it is less than the state dot config dot page size, that means we are at the end of our pagination. Next I'm going to calculate the previous page and the next page. So previous page, if our page is greater than 1, that means we are simply subtract 1 in our page to get the previous page, else simply use null. For the next page, check end of pagination. If it is true, that means we don't have any page left in the backend. Else, you can simply use your page and plus 1 in it, so it will give you the next page information. Okay, so now it's time to create remote key corresponding to each image entity and store that information into our room database. So for that I'm going to create remote keys naming variable. Use our remote images map remote key, and in this remote key I'm having id. So id is coming from it.id. Just convert this thing into a string. Previous key is coming in the form of previous page, next key is coming in the form of next page, and query is coming in the constructor from the constructor of this image remote mediator. Simply use your remote key data access object, insert all of the information. Cool. So now it's time to insert all of the information in our image entity table. So image data access object dot insert all and pass your remote images in it. But the thing is, requirement of this function is list of image entity, but we are receiving list of ImageDTO. So now it's time to use mappers. So for that, in this load, I'm going to create a variable, and the variable name is mapper, and initialize this thing with ImageDTO to image entity mapper and pass query. Scroll down and use here mapper.map all, pass your remote images in it. Alright, so we are pretty much done with it. Now it's at the end, I'm gonna return this mediator result. So mediator result dot success, simply use here end of pagination reached and return keyword in front of your try. Now I'm gonna write a logic that is used to prevent API calls if we have information regarding that query in our room database. So for that I'm using here condition in the if, and here I'm using my ImageDTO object dot get count corresponding query, pass your query. So if it is greater than page, multiply this thing with state dot config dot page size. So if it is true, that means we are having information corresponding to this query in our room database. Simply use return keyword mediator result dot success and end of pagination is false, because let's say you are running out of the information, then you should continue with this. It will simply fetch information from the backend and store that information into your room database. So yeah, we are pretty much done with our load function. Now this initialize function is used to decide where you want to refresh or not at your initial loading. So here first I'm gonna check has local data. Use ImageDTO object dot get count corresponding to query, pass your query. If it is greater than 0, that means we have some information regarding this query. So if has local data is true, that means we should use initialize JSON action and skip the initial refresh, else we should go for the initial refresh. Initialize action dot launch initial refresh. Remove this thing and use a return in front of your if. So this initialize is actually used to decide whether you want to refresh your page or not. So we are pretty much done with our remote mediator. Now it's time to use it. So for that, first thing first, go to your domain layer repository, and here I'm gonna add one function, and the function name is get remote mediator images. Query is same, but the return type is different. So this time I'm using flow of paging data. Type of this thing is image. Go to the implementation of your repository and implement this member. Now here I'm gonna create a pager, and this pager has a config. So use here paging config. Pass your page size, which is 10, then use prefetch distance, which is 1, enable placeholder. Yes, I want to use this in a placeholder, and lastly the initial load size, which is 10. So we have our configuration. Next we have our paging source factory. Now this time this paging source factory is eventually used from the room database. So in order to use that thing, you should pass your image data access object in here. So this is a private variable. Image data access object dot get images, pass your query in it. Next we have a remote mediator. So simply create our image remote mediator instance in here. Just use alt enter to specify all the argument. We have to pass our query in it. Next we have to pass our image data access object. Next we have to pass remote key data access object. So go in your constructor and add these things, remote key data access object, and lastly we have to pass API service. API service already passed, so simply remove this thing. Scroll down, and in place of RemoteKeyDao you should use RemoteKeyDao. In place of API service, use API service. As you can see, return type of this thing is flow, paging data, image. We have a problem in here, and the problem is this is an experimental API, so use that thing first. And the next problem is, as you can see, return type of this thing is pager int image entity, but my return type is flow paging data image. So let's convert this thing into this. So for that, first thing first, I'm gonna inject my mapper. So image entity to image mapper, and use here flow dot map it dot map image entity to image mapper dot map and pass it in it. So it will simply use to convert the type from what we have previously to flow paging data image. Cool. So now it's time to use this thing in our view model, but before that make sure this is properly initializable in your module. So open up your data module. As you can see, we have to add few more parameters in our constructor. So first, image data access object, next we have a remote key data access object, and lastly we have image entity to image mapper. So pass everything in here. First we have image data access object, next we have remote key data access object, and lastly we have our image entity to image mapper. Now let's begin with our view model. So open up your main view model. As you can see, in view model we are using use cases. So let's build use case first. Go to this use case and create a class. Class name is get images from remote mediator. This is a class, and in this class I am going to inject my repository, which is image repository. Use here operator function invoke, pass your query, use image repository dot get remote mediator images and pass your query. Now we are going to use this thing in our view model. Open up your view model, private wall remote mediator. So we have get images remote mediator. I'm gonna simply use the same thing. So simply copy this thing up, paste in here, comment this thing out. So query filter, instead of using this use case, this time I'm using here remote mediator dot invoke. We are receiving the flow, so remove this dot flow. And yeah, we are pretty much done. Now it's time to execute our application to see whether it is working or not. So execute it. Alright, so application is working. Now here I'm gonna use yellow. Okay, so all the information is fetching properly. Now let's see all of the things in your app inspection. So open this app inspection. We have here database, we have image entity. As you can see, all of the images is cached properly. So initially it fetches 2 pages because our prefetch distance is 1 due to that reason. Corresponding to remote key, as you can see, currently we are standing on the page number first. That means next key is 2 and previous key is null, and query is yellow. Cool. Now I'm gonna close this application and again open this application. Type the same query. As you can see, this is coming from your room database. Scroll down. 2 pages is already there in your room DB. Now when you scroll down, it will fetch the 3rd page from the backend. First it will fetch, then store in the room DB and expose the information from a room DB in a form of paging source that you are consuming right now in your user interface. Alright, so we have only this information, I believe. Let me check how many data we have in our database. I think we are reaching the end of pagination, or there may be a problem, and the problem is open up your remote mediator. And in this remote mediator, sometimes let's say you are receiving the same ID item 2 times. Then what will happen? It will automatically stop the pagination because we have written a condition in here, and the condition is end of pagination reached. So this end of pagination reached is dependent on the remote images size. So let's say you are receiving 10 items in one page and somehow one of the item have the same ID. Now we are using here response.hitDistinctBy, so it will automatically remove the duplicate item. Now our size will become 9. So once our size will become 9, our page size is 10. This will say us we are reaching at the end of our pagination, and it will simply stop the pagination. And this is the same problem that we are facing in here, and I don't know how to fix it because this is a problem that is related to the backend. So just leave it. Rest of the things are working as you expected. So that's it for this video. I hope you like this video. It's a very cool video. We will meet in our next video where we will discuss something new about Android. Till that, goodbye. And if you are having any doubt regarding this video, just comment it on the below.